And as I was thinking about people who have really challenged me to expand my imagination and challenged me to rethink how I frame things, Glen rose to the top as somebody that I really wanted to have here to talk with everybody, to share the work that he does, and also to talk with us about different areas where we are later, different areas where we conduct our grant-making activity. Since, as you'll see, Eric's just kind of at the forefront of a lot of very interesting developments in the world today. One thing I did not know about Glen prior to today is that he was not only valedictorian at Princeton in 2007, but earned his PhD 1 year later from Princeton in economics. And actually, he had completed all the requirements for the PhD except for the 1 year residency. And so that's why he had to stick around for another year, the gall. But so a super impressive background. Glen is the founder and research lead at Microsoft Research's Plural Technology Collaboratory, co-founder and chair of the Plurality Institute, co-founder of RadicalxChange Foundation, and co-founder of the Faith, Family, and Technology Network. Collaborates closely with fascinating figures and leading technology experts like Audrey Tang, Jaron Lanier, and Vitalik Buterin. Co-authored the influential book Radical Markets and the first democratically self-governed and fully open source book, Plurality, which we have somewhere. Redmond's going to hold up a copy there for you. So that's the latest print incarnation, but it is a book that is always evolving. So without further ado, I'll just invite Glen up to share with us the talk that he's prepared.
Thank you so much, Tim. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all. Hopefully in ways that'll become apparent, I consider JTF to be one of the sort of most aligned organizations with the work we're trying to do in the world, and really hope to collaborate with you all more. So this, talk is motivated by what I think is sort of day by day, especially in the last month or so, becoming, a more broadly accepted discourse about the imminence of superintelligence that is going to sort of sweep away many social institutions, and at the same time, many fears that things won't live up to this, that it's not actually transforming organizations in the way that one might hope. So there's these sort of twin anxieties about bubbles and catastrophe at the same time. And I hope to illustrate that maybe these problems both arise from a misconception of these idea of superintelligence. So on the one hand, the usual discourse is about artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence, which is you're going to have a machine, it's going to kind of ingest lots of stuff, and then it's going to become this autonomous force whose capacities are derived by having a human evaluate how it compares against other humans. So it's sort of like this autonomous machine competing against humans. An alternative version of this, and I've had many different names for this, but recently I found one that I quite enjoyed from a colleague. This is the first time I've used this name, collective hybrid intelligence, or Qi, the Chinese life force. The idea here, I think, is best captured in this film, The Wild Robot, which Tim really enjoyed. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but I won't give away too much about it, but basically it gives a future where a robot, kind of by going off script, by not following its kind of originally intended purpose, ends up kind of integrating itself into an ecology and helping to defend it against the very sort of rapacious forces that set it in motion in the first place. So very, very interesting film. But I think the core idea here is that we already have superintelligences. We have corporations, we have religions, we have markets, we have democracies. All of these things can do better than any individual human can, many, if not most of the things that humans do. And what's coming into existence now is more sophisticated forms of collective organization that may allow us to integrate more deeply with our ecology, with our tools, with each other. And that may therefore help us realize James Lovelock's idea, pictured here, of Gaia. Gaia is the idea that, you know, there can be a global ecological, social superintelligence that's judged not by how it competes against sub-elements of that, but instead by the efficacy with which it creates self-monitoring loops of intelligence within the global ecology. Now, this paradigm is not mine alone, and I haven't included this in many other talks, but I think it's relevant for you all to be aware that there are, you know, significant other groups of researchers who are very much working in this, you know, chi spirit. One is James Evans and a series of collaborators of his that have produced a remarkable set of papers about how large AI models are actually social technologies, that they actually instantiate and represent human cultures and societies, and that even in the internal operations of these models, that they're actually regenerating that social ecology to perform their functions. So these are a couple of wonderful papers by James, who I know you guys have worked with before. There are also people like Melissa Valentine that are working on the social structures of productivity that are emergent from these models as they interact with systems, and using that to actually get these models to create productivity gains rather than just do unilaterally impressive work. And there are a number of startups and organizations doing these things like Sakana AI, Softmax, Collective Intelligence Project. But I think a real challenge has been, okay, if this is a better paradigm, why aren't we producing more things that are geared towards this, you know, chi paradigm rather than the ASI paradigm? And I think a key reason is that it's a lot easier for engineers to take as an engineering target things that are physical and can be manipulated experimentally more easily than it is to take things that are social and where there's all kinds of ethical constraints on experimental manipulation. And so those things tend to be covered instead by these like squishier fields like sociology. And so the question is, how can we make like a translation between the sort of social concepts and sociological ideas that are necessary to incorporate human societies into this vision and the like, you know, concrete optimization targets that computer scientists can work on. And I call myself a recovering economist. I used to be a professor at the University of Chicago. I've been on the wagon to recovery from economics for the better part of a decade now. But I do relapse occasionally for, you know, one really critical role that I think economics has to play, which is that it can be a really useful formalism to translate between the really precise engineering-oriented fields like computer science and the vaguer social fields like sociology. And today I want to try performing that translation in both directions on two different topics. On the one hand, I want to try to take some sociological concepts and show how they could become engineering targets by using a formalism that came from economic theory. And on the other hand, I want to try to take some of the insights about structure that have come out of the design of these artificial neural networks and use economic ideas to translate them into ways of restructuring human participation in the economy and collective decision making. Okay, and the two formalisms I want to use to do that are this idea of common knowledge that is beautifully represented in this recent book by Steven Pinker called When Everybody Knows That Everybody Knows, that I really recommend to people. And second is the idea of supply chains and supply networks that is very classical in economic theory, and that I think can be used to reimagine how we understand neural networks. Okay, so let me start with the idea of common knowledge. So perhaps the most fundamental idea in sociology is the idea of a community. Now, the question is, what does that mean? Does anyone here want to give me their definition of what a community is? I'm sure it comes up a lot in your work. That's an interesting one. That's a good one. So I have it's closer to the one that I'll propose than is the one that's in the civics book, from which I've been teaching my daughter, my first grader, to learn about basic sociological ideas. So that one says it's a group of people that share a common space. And this is very interesting, because there's a tension in the notion of community. On the one hand, a lot of these classical definitions tend to emphasize sharing some kind of physical space. On the other hand, many of the most influential theories about community, such as Benedict Anderson's work and many of the theories on community in the digital age, tend to emphasize the notion, closer to what you said, that some kind of shared ideation is, sufficient or, constitutive of a community. And I think that we have to hold both of these ideas in our head at the same time to really understand community. So there clearly is something about physically shared space that helps us get to the feeling of community that is very hard to achieve through purely informative means, I believe. And at the same time, I don't believe that community has to be defined by a shared physical space. I think it can be an information theoretic concept. And so the question is, how can we both account for this notion of physical space being important, and at the same time allow it to be an information theoretic concept? And I think that this notion of common knowledge is very powerful in helping us think about this. Okay, so common knowledge is perhaps best illustrated by a very classical, fairy tale, that of the Emperor's New Clothes. Can you raise your hand if you do not know the story of the Emperor's New Clothes? Okay, everyone knows the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. Excellent. I hope I'm not falling into the same trap at the same moment, making people unwilling to admit that they're the ones that don't know about it. But in any case, in the Emperor's New Clothes, the Emperor, of course, is not wearing any clothes, but no one's willing to acknowledge this until a child laughs in front of everyone. And what is it that the child laughing does? The key concept from common knowledge theory, which is a idea that came out of economics and game theory, is the notion that it matters not just what people know, but what people know that everyone knows, and know that everybody knows that everybody knows, and so forth. That these higher order beliefs are fundamental to, a notion of common understanding of things. And in fact, there's growing work in evolutionary psychology that shows that actually this may be the most fundamental distinguishing feature between humans and other primates, is that human children seek attention. But actually, they don't seek attention for themselves. What they actually seek is joint attention with adults. They want the adult to be attending to the same thing that they are attending to. And why is that important? Because this is the origin of creation of language. Because in order to create a symbol for the same thing, we need to both be attending to that thing at the same time and give it a name that we both recognize. And that idea that joint attention creates culture, creates meaning, I believe is the foundation of community. That really community is about the creation of shared ideation that is recognized in this common knowledge way that everyone understands and that everyone understands that everyone understands it and so forth. And in fact, this is very fundamental to all kinds of fields, including political science. So in political science, there's a lot of literature about why, and in fact, this was recently invoked by Mark Carney for anyone who saw his speech very deftly, because it was so influential in economics, which was his field, and he then used it. So why is it that pamphlets don't usually end up being that effective in starting regime change, but that protests do? Well, the idea is that you don't know who else has gotten the pamphlet. You might be persuaded by what it's saying, but you don't know who else is persuaded by it. Whereas in a protest, everyone sees everyone seeing everyone expressing something. And therefore, it's much easier to organize in that moment. And in fact, this basic idea is not just a theory. It is an engineering target for some of the most effective engineers in the world, people who work for the Chinese Communist Party. So there's a wonderful paper by Jen Pan and Molly Roberts and others showing that the Chinese Communist Party, the Great Firewall is not actually their most effective defense against social organization. Instead, it's what they call the 50-cent army. These are people who get paid to go out and put posts that polarize or distract communities that are beginning to form around collective demands, so that it's impossible to achieve common knowledge necessary to organize against the Chinese Communist Party. And in fact, those tactics that were pioneered to suppress dissent in China turned out to be optimized for the social media environment. And in fact, the things that we call polarization or isolation, when they're studied by social psychologists, actually are better described as higher level misperceptions. So the root causes of a lot of the polarization that we see have been found to be the fact that people believe that the other side believes something they don't, or even more, that they believe that the other side believes that they believe something that they don't, and so forth. So the higher you go in the hierarchy of beliefs, the more divergence there are under conditions of polarization. So I really think actually the way to describe these are not polarization. What's the real problem that we're facing is a disintegration of the common knowledge that underlies a sense of being able to communicate with each other. And I also think this is at the root of a lot of the isolation and anxiety among young people, because they receive these personalized feeds, but they don't know who else is seeing these things. And so they lose the ability to share a common culture with other people, which is one of the most fundamental needs of adolescence. Like, adolescence is all about forming communities and cultures that are outside of the family. And this is what allows adolescents to feel a sense of, quote, independence, which is not really independence. It's actually about interdependence with people other than just their family unit. And there's a wonderful science fiction book about this, actually. So in the Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, the plebeians in the society basically receive personalized entertainment feeds. And the elite, which is much smaller, read the New York Times. Why? Because the sense of common worldview allows a very small elite to govern a very disorganized society. And this was, of course, derived from things that were said about the Indians, the English in India during the period of British rule. Okay, now the lucky thing, though, is that people haven't only been working on the destructive side of engineering here, they've also been working on the constructive side. And where should you go to find the defenses against the Chinese government's attacks? Who is most successfully defending against Chinese government attacks? Anyone want to volunteer a location? Taiwan. Yes, so Taiwan was facing all sorts of Chinese government attacks, and so they developed a common knowledge creation engine to combat the common knowledge undermining engines called vTaiwan. So what does vTaiwan do? It's basically a Twitter-like system, but instead of serving content that maximizes engagement, it clusters opinions And then it serves so people get a sense of the distribution of opinions that is accurate. And then it surfaces the things that bring people together across those divides to create national common knowledge. And this idea became the foundation for a whole series of work that's called bridging algorithms. And these were the basis of what was originally called Birdwatch and became Community Notes on X. And this is now spread to pretty much all the other main social media platforms. And the way it works for those who aren't familiar with it is that if you see something on X that you think might be misleading, you can post a note on it. And then people rate the notes that they see. And the raters are clustered into opinion groups. And the notes only get perma attached to the thing that they were commenting on if across the different opinion groups there is consensus that this note is relevant and helpful. Now, there's a limitation, though, of these community note systems, a few limitations. One is that there are huge incentives for creating polarizing content, and there are zero incentives for writing one of these notes. So they can easily get swamped by the economic incentives associated with the system. Second, they only appear on things where there's kind of a general understanding that this thing is somehow misleading or incomplete. And that does nothing to just reduce the general viral spread of stuff that is malignant, but not necessarily literally misleading. So to overcome these problems, we've been working with Audrey Tang from Taiwan, who is the digital minister there, as well as some of these other folks, on a alternative structure for social media that addresses this pair of problems, as well as the fact that currently community notes only works for a single kind of divide that exists, which is basically the US left-right political divide. Because it puts everything on one spectrum, projects everything onto that. All the other divides, like within religious communities, in other jurisdictions where things don't map onto a left-right divide, it doesn't address that at all. So this idea we call pro-social media, I actually think we changed the name now to community by design. I should change this slide. But the basic idea here is that any post that you make or that you're consuming would have at the bottom of it little icons for the different communities that you've chosen to be a member of, such as the United States or the Catholic Church or the John Templeton Foundation, etc. And there would be a little green circle around it if the system had judged that this was consensual content within that community, widely agreed within that community. And a red circle if it was divisive within that community, in which case you could click on that and then see contrasting perspectives from within that community. So these things are already implicitly used in the algorithm. They're used to target advertisements, but they're not made transparent to the consumers, so people don't know the sort of social provenance of the information they're getting. And X is already building on some of our earlier versions of this, starting to do this. So within the community notes world, you can actually get these notifications of whether content is consensual or divisive. But we believe that this more pluralistic way of doing it that we're describing could be a powerful new business model. Because right now, the advertising business model is not really a general advertising business model. It's a personalized, targeted advertising business model that really is aiming to get you to empty a shopping cart based on purchases you already made. But what it doesn't do is create the kind of common knowledge that things like the Apple commercial in 1984 at the Super Bowl did, where you create a meaning for a brand within a community. And that's why, per impression, people are willing to pay much more for those kinds of broad cultural moments than they are for the personalized advertisements, because they create meaning. which is more important than just getting you to do something which you might already do afterwards anyway. And so if we can create these sort of community consensual content spaces and then attach advertisements to that context, one great inspiration for that actually was the way that advertising works in Christianity Today. So you don't see in Christianity Today personalized ads trying to get you to target, to empty your shopping cart. You find stuff that wants to associate itself with a Christian context, right? And both the Christianity Today and the people who choose to advertise there are going to put things in this context of things that are broadly accepted among a Christian community. And we also believe that you could get institutions like universities, like governments, directly paying to boost the prominence of context that creates this coherence within their community. So we believe by shifting the model from personalized advertisement or just subscription to communities support and advertising associated with that community, you could fundamentally change the dynamics of this environment. And that's what we're working on experimenting now with. So together with Jonathan Stray from Berkeley, Renee DeResta from Georgetown, and Nicole Brennan from Harvard, we are building joint infrastructure for a bunch of the AT protocol services, including Skylight and Blue Sky, as well as, because we need the signal and because they're very interested, some of the far right, free speech maximalist networks, infrastructure that allows them to serve this kind of community uniting content. This project's called Green Earth because it's the foundation for Blue Sky. Okay, but we believe that the social media environment is where the puck is now. But we believe the place it's going is people interacting with content through AI. And we believe that the solution there is a version of these ideas, but targeted at the way that AI models respond to people. So the notion is that rather than AI models, when you ask them about something that's potentially controversial, where there's contested ethics on how the model should respond, that rather than responding from a global perspective or from a sort of sycophantic personal relationship perspective, instead it should respond from the perspective of the communities that someone is a member of. So that would give you the Catholic perspective on what you're asking, but it would also clarify that this is controversial within the United States and allow you to see perspectives from people in the United States. And this is something we're working on both internal to Microsoft and with a range of collaborators, both on the sort of side of applications. So we're building it with a number of researchers, as well as the philosophical foundations. We've been working with communitarian philosophers, including Patrick Deneen, on how to think about what is the appropriate philosophy that could bring communities together with these tools. Okay. Let me now shift to the second topic. Okay, so now this is, how do we take something that's in in computer science, in neural networks, and bring it to the social rather than the other way around? So, as many of you are probably aware, a core constituent of neural network of these AI models is this idea of a neural network. These neural networks have many, many layers of nodes that each connect in many ways to the nodes before them, and data flows through them and they produce some kind of an output, and then based on whether the output is accurate or not, a signal flows back through the network to retrain its connections. And this is usually understood by analogy to neuroscience and Hebbian association. But this is also very reminiscent. In fact, in the early days of neural networks was modeled by some important figures, not in relationship to neuroscience, but instead in relationship to supply chains. So people have raw inputs, they produce them into more partial. These then get refined into more finished products that get distributed to wholesalers, that get distributed to retailers, that eventually are bought by consumers. And then, revenue is earned, and that goes back to pay all the people along the various chains. And the businesses that do a good job of supplying become stronger. The businesses that do a poor job of supplying become less central to this network, and so forth. And the thing that I think is powerful about this alternative analogy is that it offers a way for these networks to be seen not as separated from, but constitutive of human economies and societies. You can imagine that there is this artificial in silicon neural network that exists, but that actually this is receiving input from and providing outputs to other neural networks in our brains, in other models, in the social structure of a society, et cetera. And if you think about it that way, then actually what we want to be doing when we're training these networks is not just updating the internal links, but updating the ways that they associate with, draw upon, and provide rewards to all the other elements that they don't have direct control over when they're trained. So what could that look like? Well, I think the simplest version of it is that we could use the same signal that's used to train these networks to form associations between it and organizations and people. And then when they're used and provide economic value, to back propagate that not just in the network, but to the people who are part of it, so that you could give economic reward, paycheck, a sense of dignity, a sense of contribution to the people who are contributing the data that train the models. But it's not just reward that you need to back propagate. So if you think about it, what would be a network like this that already exists? That of shareholdings. So most companies are owned actually to a large extent by other companies, investment companies, and John Templeton certainly knew about that. And eventually those flow to individuals, but those shares don't only bring economic rights, they also bring control rights. And in fact, what neural networks are actually doing internally is a bunch of voting. So this, to my knowledge, is the oldest diagram drawn by human hands that looks like a recombinant neural network. Does anyone know what that is? From the 13th century in Venice. And it was the way that they elected the Doge. And it was also related to various ways in which the Pope was elected at various times. And it involved people electing members of committees that elected members of committees and eventually elected the Doge. And the idea is that this avoided the corruptibility that can occur in almost any direct election system. By creating this, multi-layer of deliberation structure, it overcame that. And effectively, that's what's going on in neural networks. There are these many layers of voting, on voting, on voting, on voting, on voting. And rather than thinking about alignment, as it's usually understood in AI, as people judging outputs, you can imagine something much more similar to a current production system where people who are critical to various cultural and semiotic notions that go into the network play roles in adjusting and providing their expertise to disciplining those notions. So rather than ending up with this sort of global autonomous, behemoth, we instead end up with something closer to how we conceptualize a decentralized economy today, where people are, have division of labor into different areas and have expertise in different domains and shape the behavior of the system towards its productivity in those areas. And one area that I want to mention that I think is particularly interesting for this is science, because I know that's relevant to you all. You all are probably aware that a huge problem facing science right now is that it's become much cheaper to produce things that look like research papers. So how do you judge whether they have a real contribution? Now you might say we just want to detect AI, but that's not really right. There's every possibility that AI is going to produce, in fact, every likelihood that AI is going to produce superior research papers, or at least that there's going to be almost no high quality research within a couple of years that doesn't have a very large component of AI contributing to the production of that research. So just saying it came from a human is not an answer. What we need to figure out is some way of thinking about, is this thing a marginal contribution to knowledge broadly conceived? That's going to be, much more valuable than what we had before. And certainly than the equilibrium without us being able to judge that given the volume of stuff that's going to be produced. And that requires precisely having these models be able to trace what it was, either by introspection or by mechanistic interpretability, led to the model's state being able to understand and interpret more things than it could in the past. It will also be critical to researchers to get that guidance so they know what ideas have potential value, because just going through the motions of persuading people in your field that something's interesting is much less efficient way of getting a signal on that than could be this model interpreted reaction to what this contributes to state of knowledge. So these are things that I'm working on very actively with Jaron Lanier, Alex Imas from the University of Chicago, and Pepe Montiel Olea from Cornell. So let me just summarize, and then we can chat a little bit more. I think we have these, increasingly yawning chasm between AI is about to eat everything in the world and change, everything and run away and maybe kill us all. And there are no productivity gains from AI yet that we can detect, and maybe it's all a bubble and it's going to crash down. And I think that these things that seem like opposite perspectives are actually two sides of the same coin. They both result from the separation of the tools from the social fabric that is constitutive of them and that can really make them work. Because when you make that separation, they aren't that useful. And when you make that separation, they become dangerous because they can go off and be autonomous and crush everything. Instead, I think we need a what I would call symbiogenic view, where what we are doing is just as we've done with corporations, just as we've done with religions, just as we've done with democracies and markets, building ourselves together into a superorganism that more completely is self-aware and conscious and capable of achieving greater things. And my hope is by connecting sort of the social sciences, theology, et cetera, into the fabric of how we build digital systems, that we can help achieve that symbiogenesis. So thank you.